Welcome to Green and Red, scrappy politics for scrappy people. A regular podcast on radical, environmental and anti-capitalist politics. Brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California today. And as always, I am joined by
Bob Bazanko in Houston, Texas.
We're going to have a pretty interesting episode for you today. We're going to talk about some theme that we've talked about a bunch in the past, which is around the political parties and ruling elites and policy. But before we're recording this the morning after the presidential debate, the first and probably only presidential debate. But before I say that, because Bob is a part-time resident of Ohio, I just want to say, Bob, that when you invited me to come to Ohio and have hot dogs, I thought you had something else in mind. And then when you said, let's eat some catfish, I thought you were talking about seafood. So I just want to say I'm a little off. I'm a little thrown from that whole thing.
Let me point out, Springfield is downstate. Like, I'm in the Northeast part. So those downstaters, who knows? Now, I have seen people eat carpet possum, but in Niles, we would never touch dog or cat.
Yeah.
Not a chance. So.
Yeah. And it's ironic that J.D. Vance and Donald Trump are really digging in on the eating of cats and dogs when they've really embraced the endorsement of Robert F. Kennedy, who has openly admitted that he picks up roadkill bear cubs to eat the meat.
And cuts the heads off of dead whales
for his skull collection. But he's not weird or ridiculous or anything like that.
Yeah, it's America. I don't know what to say.
And we don't even have to go into the gender surgery of illegal aliens in prison or anything like that, or in schools, apparently,
Yeah, I think that debate really showed us a lot, right? You have two candidates. One is telling us that Trump is the greatest threat ever to democracy, to our way of life, which we've been hearing since 2015 or 2016, right? But on really crucial issues like the border, guns, fracking, foreign wars, they're in complete agreement, right? And that's, I think, segues into what we're talking about today. This is a right-wing country. It's a very conservative right-wing country. As Noam Chomsky always said, Americans believe it's stuff that the most fundamentalist people abroad, how Americans make fun of Islam and things like that. They believe in science. Here in the United States, there are people who genuinely think the U.S. is 4,000 years old.
Dinosaurs ran around the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. Surprised they even still believe in dinosaurs, but there you have it.
Yeah, it is. It's a very right-wing country, and that's why I think it's important to talk about this stuff, as we did many times in 2020 and 2021. We did several shows surrounding the theme, the ruling class versus Donald Trump, and that's what we're doing, the 2024 edition of it today, because I think it's important to understand the larger political context.
And the kind of important thing, the one thing I want to say to open this up is that, and we've talked about this a lot, this is what a lot of our episodes are about, is that we actually are seeing a lot of destabilization to the system right now. We're gone through and are still going through a global pandemic. There's all kinds of economic issues. We have a widening class divide. Institutions and the social safety net is being whittled away by neoliberals and right-wingers and libertarians. We're in the midst of a climate crisis, which both candidates, one thinks it's a hoax. The other just didn't really want to talk about it because he doesn't want to, upset oil and gas. We have a political crisis with the rise of the far right. And then we have escalating conflict in places in the Ukraine and the Middle East and things like that. So we're in a world of crises, bumping into other crises. And it's an important thing to mention as we talk a little bit about some of this, how the elites are lining up in this election season.
Yeah, one of the key points we made in 2020 and 21, especially in the summer of 2020, when the street rebellions were taking place, was that capitalists, obviously, they want profit, they want to make money, they want political control. But one of the key elements in their entire ideology is stability. At various times, they'll use words like harmony and cooperation. They have immense power, and they're certainly in no way friends or allies of people like us. But they need stability. There is an old kind of capitalist idea, which today would be derided as woke, right? Corporations, right? The stability is important. You want to keep people like reasonably content so that they're not trying to cut your throat. They're not trying to take over the factory. They're not trying to go out and strike. You're not having general strikes. You don't have farmers uprising. You don't have things like Haymarket and Homestead and Pullman and the little steel strike and on, or the civil rights movement, right? At some point, capitalists who have a little bit of sense, who are a little more forward thinking, want to stabilize the system. And Trump is the most unstable steward of capitalism that they've seen, right? He's taking care of them, tax cuts. He's promised even more tax cuts, a reduction from was 21 to 15% on the corporate tax rate. So they'll be paying less. They probably already do pay less than you and I do. So stability is crucial. And that's why I think even as lefties, most lefties, I don't know most, but a lot of lefties want to just dismiss any consideration of the ruling class. They're all scum. They're all capitalist pigs. There's good reason to think that way. But the reality is there are schisms, there are breaks, there are fissures within that ruling class, which are important, I think, for us as leftists to understand. As much as, and a lot of people get mad at me for saying this, there's no real left resistance in the United States. You have pockets at various times. I think the stuff that you and the people you work with do on climate change is important, right? And that tends to be fairly aggressive. We had that talk the other day with Professor Zaitov about being more aggressive, being more militant. But the reality is, you really can't say that there's an active left resistance in the U.S. You had spontaneous uprisings in some places in 2020, but
I think there's moments where these different movements are able to assert power. Like I feel like the anti-genocide movement has actually been doing that really well this year. And there are times where I feel like the climate movement has done that. But there's not institutions of resistance. There's not institutions organizing to counter the power of capital or industry. And that used to be the labor movement. And we're seeing a resurgent labor movement and how hopefully that'll last. But there's not institutions, there's not community institutions, there's not a national movement, people's institutions to resist this stuff like we see in other countries. And it's definitely not filtered into political parties.
Yeah, you have a few months of a very impressive uprising in 2020, but for the most part, basically we're left with the fray being held at a national level with these elections. That's what the vast majority of Americans gear into, right? So they may even have a structural analysis of all the problems we face, but the solution, the response generally comes down to make sure you vote. And for a lot of people, make sure you vote for the Democratic candidate, whoever that be, wherever that be. And since we're in this kind of very narrow political framework, this very narrow spectrum, except for some of us who are beyond that, right? And I think as you used to be able to say the extreme right, but the extreme right is clearly within that very narrow acceptable framework. So that's the problem. The only people outside of it are us, because you can have as crazy, like Trump and Harris basically adopted what would traditionally be hardcore GOP positions, right? I have a gun and I want to be tough against the border and we want to shut down the border and we believe in fracking and all that kind of stuff. So this is what we're up against. This is seen as our only outlet. And at the same time, they really are, as we've known for our whole lives, really, it's a corporate conservative party. The Democratic Party is the right wing. The Republicans are a far right extremist, often batshit crazy party. So these are the choices we face, right? Do you want fourth stage pancreatic cancer or stage 3 lung cancer? These are the kind of choices we have right now. And so I think talking about that is useful. And I think because in 2020, we spent a lot of time talking about the role that people like Jamie Dimon and Mark Milley, the National Association of Manufacturers, the Chambers of Commerce, a bunch of bankers and investors played. And
Wall Street Journal op-ed page.
And they put the final nail into Trump in 2020. And again, we saw a very weak Democratic Party that year. We saw a weak presence after the election. Most groups that were going to go into the streets and protest called them all off. In lieu of that kind of active, very active and aggressive and maybe militant direct action against the political system, this focus on, you're going to vote for Harris, you got to vote for Stein. And basically they're all the same, right? This intense obsession with electoral politics, then I think the ruling class becomes more important. And they're not saviors, but it's not a bad thing to get rid of Donald Trump. I think it would be to all of our benefits if he wasn't president. Now, that doesn't transfer in my particular case to an endorsement of Harris, because even if all things were different, what's happening in Gaza should be, to me at least, is disqualifying. But so I think let's begin just by talking first about, because we're going to talk about the ruling class versus Trump, which we've done before. I'm going to make it clear that's not a uniform position, right? There are
Not a monolith.
Not a monolith. And so a lot of these people there, Trump does have support. Some of the support comes from more traditional kind of Republican supporters and donors, some of whom I call lumpen oligarchs, and some are from kind of newer groups. And I think you sent me an article about that. I don't know if you want to say a few things about it, like the U lines and others.
Yeah, I think it was The Guardian actually just published this article a couple of days ago that there's about 6 billionaires, which have been, at last count, have been like very supportive of Trump. And they've been putting and some of them have put significant amounts of money into his campaign, including Miriam Adelson. And Elon Musk has started a pro-Trump super PAC, although he's given no personal money to Trump's campaign. Blackstone's Steve Schwartzman, who's a asset manager and finance person, has put a lot of money into Trump since 2016. And then Tim Mellon, who is heir to the Gilded Age Mellon family, which really started with Andrew Mellon, who was a steel magnate, and he was Secretary of the Treasury for 3 different presidents in the 1920s and the early 30s, who helped start the Great Depression, also hobnobbed with people like Mussolini through the course of his career, who was actually prosecuted and persecuted by the sort of New Deal Democrats once they came into power. But the Mellons, billionaires, and would love to return to this Gilded Age, which is one of the things that Trump and his libertarian billionaire buddies want to do.
Yeah, Mellon's grandfather or great grandfather, when the market crashed in October of 1929, Mellon said, liquidate stocks, liquidate labor. People will lead more moral lives if they have nothing, right? Just get rid of it all. Yeah, that's what we're up against. But you mentioned Muriel Adelson, who is her husband's a major donor and a campaign, a casino.
Her late husband. He's dead now.
Late husband, yes. Yeah. Sheldon Adelson. Casino owner. Steve Wynn, another casino owner. Adelson also recently bought the Dallas Mavericks in the NBA from Mark Cuban, who we'll mention in a minute because Cuban's on the other side. Bill Ackman is very activist, the guy who was like the driving force behind these horrific attacks on students this spring at Harvard and elsewhere. Elon Musk, of course. And the U-Lines, I think, are interesting because the U-Lines own a company out of Illinois that makes shopping bags and boxes and things like that. And these are what I would call the lumpen oligarchs, right? These old industry type people, right? When this is generally what Trump has made this really hardcore appeal to oil companies, these extractive industries, to coal, to things like that. But he also has some of these new tech, I don't know if they're tech bros or not, but yeah, like Peter Thiel. And
we didn't even mention Peter Thiel.
And so it's a weird coalition. It's definitely not a traditional Republican coalition. Some of the old lumpen oligarchs, people like Blue Lions or
Mellons
and the oil companies and coal, operators and things like that can't be. But in general, it's a different coalition, but it's not typical of what you would see in an election year with the Republican Party. Now, keep in mind, too, and this is something that most people don't understand, most Democrats especially, Democratic Party has always been a party of finance. Since the days of Woodrow Wilson, Wall Street and investors often have been more likely to be Democrats than Republicans. That was clearly the case in the last couple of elections before this. In 2016, Hillary Clinton just destroyed Trump in terms of fundraising among investors, among hedge funds and so forth. And so did Biden. And Harris was a huge recipient in the 2020 primary of this kind of money. And she's getting it again. So she's getting a ton of corporate money, right? This is like the Democrats still, I don't even know if they maintain the myth anymore. We're the party of the working people. Growing up, that was the thing. Republicans were the party of rich people, the Democrats were the party of working people. I'm not even sure they even try to pretend that anymore. So this is what we're up against. So I think it's important to talk a little bit about how the Democrats are running this election and what the ruling class and some of these people are doing. And I think one way to start this, because this is something that is really quite amazing, is that the Democratic Party has recently embraced kinds of Republicans. We'll talk about that. But most notably, they have embraced the Dark Lord himself, right? The satanic overlord of American wars in the early 21st century, right? Dick Cheney. And they are now proudly boasting that Dick Cheney is
honored to have Dick Cheney's endorsement.
And of course, his daughter, Liz Cheney, voted with Trump. What did you say? Like 90 over, over 90%?
It's 92% according to.
So she voted with
538.
And in a lot of ways, I think this is a person.
And voted for Trump twice. Let's just be clear about that.
Yeah.
Liz Cheney voted for him in 2016 and 2020.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this really says a lot, right? About the kind of performative nature of what they do. They don't have any issues with Trump's policies or what he does. I think to some degree, I think there's a jealousy from Dick Cheney because Trump gets away with all this crazy shit that Cheney pioneered, right? And Trump is just taking it even further. So there may be a little jealousy that Trump has actually out-Cheneyed the Cheneys, right?
And for Trump's rhetoric too, is that the forever wars that were started by Bush and Cheney were bad for America. And he comes from a perspective that's probably different than those of us on the left. But still, he's highly critical of Bush and Cheney. He's highly critical of that sort of Republican establishment that's pro-empire and called people like John McCain like a sucker and a loser and that sort of thing, which I also think really has offended a lot of those Republican elites as well. Like Meghan McCain and Jimmy McCain, the son, have both also said they're going to vote for Kamala Harris.
Yeah. Cheney said that Trump is the
I'm
greatest.
sure Cindy McCain will too. She's kind of a closet Democrat anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. Cheney said Trump was the greatest threat to the republic, that he can't be trusted with power. So again, we're not talking about policies or anything like that. They love the tax cuts on billionaires, and they probably have no problem with attacking the border. And we know that Dick Cheney likes guns. Somebody who's hunted with them.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's a personal thing. But in addition to that, if we said the Kamala Harris, or look at some of her surrogates, right? Who are they? Kinzinger, Republican representative from Illinois, Olivia Troy, who was at the debate last night, who was at was it NSC? I believe she was in the NSC with Trump. Stephanie Grisham was, I believe, a press secretary.
Mhm.
Was it Alyssa Farah Griffin, who I forget was in Trump's inner circle? And of course, my favorite, Mooch, Anthony Scaramucci. As I grew up in an Italian town, and I grew up with like mooches all over the place. Like when I saw him, I was like, oh, I know this guy.
And he was Trump's communications director for 10 days.
That is not known as a Scaramucci. A 10-day period is known as a Scaramucci, right? And there's an organization which the Democrats have embraced called Republicans for Harris, I'm sorry, which is especially targeting Nikki Haley primary voters.
Mm.
And the point here is that they sat back passively while AIPAC did hit jobs on people like Jamal Bowman and Cory Bush and defeated them, went after Ilhan Omar and Summer Lee and didn't get down. You notice they left AOC alone, which I think really clearly shows where she is now, where she lies on the spectrum now. AOC is just one of them. I think she's gunning to be Senator AOC at some point, right? So they've gone out of their way. During the debate last night, Harris invoked military people quite a bit. I think she mentioned Mark Milley. She mentioned Mark Esper, who was Trump's Secretary of Defense, who's come out against them. And there's a whole H.R. McMaster and Mattis and
John Bolton,
all of these people who really are war criminals. They're all war criminals. And they are now part of
there's 200 Republicans who've come out, 200 former Bush, Romney, McCain, who were two presidential candidates plus former president staffers who've all come out and said they're going to support Harris.
Yeah.
You haven't actually John Kelly, Mark Esper, John Bolton, or Mike Pence all say they're going to vote for Kamala Harris, but they have all said that Trump is not fit to be president. There's a new ad out from one of these Republicans for Harris groups, which has interviews with all of those former high level Trump administration people who say, actually in the actual quote, which I think they were running last night during the debate in some markets. In 2016, Donald Trump said he would choose only the best people to work in his White House. Now those people have a warning for America. Trump is not fit to be America again. Fears his vice president. Mad Dog Mattis is another one as well, who actually, the one thing we didn't mention that happened in January 2021 is that the 10 living secretaries of defense at the time came out with a letter in the Washington Post right before January 6th saying that we needed a peaceful transfer of power, which included Mattis and I believe included Esper, as well as Dick Cheney and a bunch of Democratic secretaries of defense.
Now, Rumsfeld was already dead. Was Rumsfeld still alive?
And actually Rumsfeld signed that as well. That was before Rumsfeld died. And Robert Gates, who was CIA director for Daddy Bush and Secretary of Defense for both W and Obama.
Yeah. And that plays into to Harris and the Democrats in general. Here in Texas, the guy running for the Senate against Texas was Colin already. They're all running these ads stressing their bipartisanship, which is like right now, probably one of the least important elements in American politics. It just, who cares? You ever see Donald Trump talk about bipartisanship or any? No, they're waging this like scorched earth war, which Harris actually pointed out last night. He just wants to like attack people and make them angry. But on the other hand, you have Harris saying, I'll put a Republican in my cabinet. They had Republicans speaking at their convention. They embraced Cheney. But when it comes to something, Palestine is obviously the most obvious. They wouldn't even have a symbolic speech at the Democratic National Convention.
They wouldn't even let a Palestinian speak who was like a Democratic state legislature in Georgia, which is an important swing state. Which has a larger than usual Muslim population in Atlanta.
We've seen the polling in swing states, something like, in all of these states, I think the minimum is 60%, sometimes even more. In all 7 swing states, at least 60% of Democrats said that there should be a ceasefire in Gaza. And I think part of that was also like, would you be more likely to vote for the candidate? They said yes. And I don't know how this is going to play out. Obviously, Harris crushed him in the debate, but so could like Pet Cap if they didn't need him first, right? Do your cats know about this? Do your cats know? Like,
I mean, I made sure they were nice and safe inside last night. I'll say
that. It's incredible, isn't it? How you can get these like racist tropes, right? That was always the stereotype of Chinese restaurants and shit like that. They're stealing cats. This has been like forever, well over a century, and they still do it. It's just quite, and they know I don't know if they know it's false. I assume they do, but they do it anyway, right? It's just preposterous. And so you have a debate focused on issues like, do you eat cats, right? Do immigrants eat cats, right? You know what's funny? And this is actually true. Italian immigrants in the early 20th century would put big nets up outside their tenements and catch birds like starlings and eat them because they were poor, right? And that never became like the stereotype of Italians. So at any rate, I'm a lost thing. But the Democratic Party is clearly, and this is something we've talked about a million times. We had Chauncey on talking about it. The Democratic Party has been very rapidly and steadily moving to the right, really since the 68 or 70 elections, however you want to peg it, right?
Right.
And so we're seeing that now where Harris is very upset. You have all this righteous anger, and she cuts in and says, I need to correct the point. Both I and Tim Walz own guns, and we're not going to come for your guns. That's like a moment of epiphany, a moment of passion, right? To say, hey, by the way, we own guns too, which is just, it's insane. You know, and what, a week after another school shooting, right?
Yeah.
They talked about gun ownership, but not school shootings.
I also want to say that we have all these ex-Republican officials, including as high ranking as the former vice president, coming out in support of Harris. We have military people, which I bet we go into a little bit deeper here in a minute, ex-Trump high ranking officials, and still 93% of Republicans plan to vote for Trump. And there's also where Harris and Walz are like moving to the right on issues like guns and the border and things like that. Still 93% of Republicans still plan to vote for Trump, right? I just want to say that's where we're at as a country. Trump goes off the rails in that debate last night. He goes off the rails in every rally he has, right? He talks about sharks and getting electrocuted versus getting eaten sharks and how much he loves Hannibal Lecter. And now he got in an argument about whether Haitian migrants are eating Springfield, Ohio with the moderator last night. And yet that doesn't budge 45% of the electorate in supporting him. That's where we're at in dystopic America 2024.
And for the Democrats, that 7% or whatever it is of Republicans who don't support Trump is their target, right? They have a built-in constituency of anti-war activists and labor activists, all kinds of stuff, but they're just more or less ignored. Now, was it Ed Rand? I see it attributed to Schumer a lot, the idea that we'll lose a working class white guy, but we'll get 2 Republican women in the suburbs, right?
Yeah.
And I thought that was actually from Ed Rendell, who's been the governor of Pennsylvania at the time, but maybe it was Schumer. But that's been their go-to policy, really. I think Obama actually got significant elements of working class votes, but since then it's been a significant decline, right? Especially in 2016. And the weird thing is, like, on a lot of these key issues, Trump is actually speaking to Americans in I got to be careful because I'm not going to say in a lefty way, but he's taking positions that I think a lot of Americans, working class Americans, would agree with, right?
Anti-elite populist.
Anti-elite populism, right? He hates you. It's all disingenuous bullshit, right? He hates you because he could get rid of them, right? If he could. But the Democrats,
I think during the RNC, he came out and attacked Sean Shane actually pretty good.
Yeah, he did. Yeah. But the Democrats don't go the other way and try to recoup this constituency, which they boasted of having for so long, right? They're the party of NAFTA. There was recently a really good article, I think in the New York Times, about how NAFTA broke American politics, which is something that like people who study this stuff have been saying, at least since 2016. The typical liberal response is that Trump won because of racism. And there's no doubt that a lot of Trump supporters are racist or racist adjacent, or it's not a deal killer, right? Just like genocide isn't a deal killer for Democratic voters, right? But NAFTA was a huge deal in 2016. And like I said, I spent a lot of time in Ohio. And that was what people there were talking about. The Clintons and the Democrats didn't do shit for us. They brought NAFTA in. We were already reeling. They made it worse. They stuck the knives in our back. And in the closest districts in those industrial states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan and elsewhere, in 2016, the areas that flipped from Obama to Trump tended to be areas that NAFTA hit hard, or where there were job losses due to Chinese or whoever company.
Deindustrialization, right?
Deindustrialization, right? And that was attributed to the Democratic Party where it belonged, frankly. Clearly, the Republicans didn't have any problem with it, but
the Clintons owned the passage of NAFTA. It was supported by the Republican establishment at the time, as well. But Clinton owns that, right? And he's proud, and they're proud of it.
Yeah. In 2016, Hillary Clinton just ran like a fucking Goldwater campaign, really. Going to the Hamptons and going to Goldman Sachs and giving talks at Citibank and Morgan Chase and all that kind of stuff. And so it's not surprising that you would have this. It's not even a flip-flop. This has always been the case, but to have this ruling class division, and you have a lot of them who are explicitly condemning and opposing Trump. There was also a letter that went around. I believe 88 corporate leaders signed it. And then somebody we've mentioned before, Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, who's the chief executive or whatever,
Yale Business
Yale
School.
Chief Executive Leadership Institute. He's the head of it, who has done like significant work. Anybody out there listening knows him. Tell him to come on. We've tried to get him on, but without any luck. Well, I guess we're not Yale enough for it, maybe, or something. I don't know.
We're not the New York Times. We're not the New York Times. We're not Ezra Klein here.
No, but Sonnenfeld's been studying these kind of what he calls corporate leadership, we would call ruling class people, for a long time. And in 2020, he made it clear that they were opposed to him. And he said this again, there's not a single Fortune 100 CEO who's donated even a penny to Trump's campaign. Now, these billionaires like Thiel and Musk, they're not as reliant on the kind of consumptive economy that Fortune 100 companies are. So what Trump will do, especially the destabilization, is really important in their day-to-day lives. In the summer of 2020, in the summer of 2020, corporations responded to what was going on in the street. They had to, right? Because it was really bad for the economy to have 25 million people out in the streets every night, throwing bricks at targets and burning down police precincts and blowing up ATM. I don't think they did that. I think they did disrupt they kind of monkey wrenched a couple ATM machines and stuff like that, right? And all of a sudden you see corporations who have Black Lives Matter flags, and they have set-asides, scholarships and things, and LGBTQ rainbow flags.
And within their mission, what I would call a mission statement, but I think in corporate America, it's more popular known as a purpose statement. It's all around inclusion, right?
Yeah.
Racial orientation differences, all of that sort of thing.
And they derive this as woke capitalism. And this is what you and I have talked about many times. The old days, it was called corporate liberalism, which is a big factor, right? As capitalism has been around, really, for as long as capitalism existed, right? You need markets. You want your workers to be at least somewhat content so they're not out blowing stuff up. You don't want 25 million of the people in the streets throwing bricks through Target and blowing up police precinct, right? Another area where Harris is like to the right of old school Republicans is funding the police, right? And Trump keeps saying she's going to defund the police. Biden and Harris gave the police in federal fines, $300 billion more, right? So in no way will these people in any world outside of the U.S. in 2024 be confused for progressives or to call them Marxist and all that. Trump, it's funny because it's like, you're a liberal, radical, socialist Marxist. Dude, you can't be all those. They're contradictory.
I also want to note, as far as the instability thing goes, the sort of campus occupations that were happening in the spring, which are starting to heat back up, warm up, at least right now, that's also like an element of destabilization, especially on these elite universities at Columbia and NYU and UCLA and things like that. And that when they sent the police in, they're sending them in against the children of these corporate CEOs or grandchildren of these corporate CEOs. I think that is an interesting thing to note, it didn't stop the Democratic university administrators and mayors and governors from doing that. But it is an interesting kind of twist in that.
And perhaps the main instigator and all that was Bill Allen, who was actually a big Trump supporter. Yeah, this stuff was connected. And again, the Democratic Party just has abandoned any pretense, and this is not new news, everybody's known this for a long time, but they've abandoned any pretense of being a party of working people or whatever. But to get back, so this letter came out with 88 corporate leaders, and we'll talk about some of the people on it. But to me, the most interesting, obviously, which I think got a lot of the headlines, was the CEO of Fox News, James Murdoch, who is Murdoch's son, who has been
the heir apparent to the Murdoch empire.
The other son was a Lachlan. Didn't he leave the company, or didn't he? Something happened to him, or he's not as involved, I think, anymore.
Yeah.
Could be wrong.
My understanding is he's the more right wing of the children.
Yeah, he is. Yeah, absolutely. And James Murdoch has been harshly critical of Trump pretty much forever, but he is actively supporting Kamala Harris this year. So I think that was very interesting. And it'll be interesting to see as this goes on, and if you start to see more people from that right wing atmosphere, the far right atmosphere, right? It's sort of like Jimmy Dimon is only concerned about money. And his ideology is capitalist expansion. But the Murdochs were crazies. They were some of the main founders of this modern crazy right-wing movement.
They've basically the architects of the media landscape, which has allowed all of this to grow the way it has.
Absolutely. Which is, we talked about, what was his first name? I forgot. The guy we talked to, Zaiton.
It's awesome.
Tom said that the other day, right? That kind of right-wing media, it's even more important than social media for creating these anger and these resentments and all this kind of stuff. So Murdoch is really, I think, this. One of the names that caught my attention was Lynn Forster de Rothschild. So we know the Rothschild, old money family, old banking family. Ted Leonsis, who is the sports team owner, was the two Washington basketball teams. Mark Cuban, who used to own a basketball team. Who, I think, was he an investor? I mean, just like a hedge fund guy, or how he made his billions? I don't remember. But
yeah, I think he was a venture capitalist.
I think so. Yeah. And Cuban has been like really critical of Trump pretty much forever, and really has ratcheted up recently. Barry Diller, who was the head of one of the Hollywood studios, big media guy, which isn't that unusual.
Paramount.
You have, I forget her name now, Steve Jobs' ex-wife. Shit, I forgot her name. Well, he's very active in the Harris campaign. A lot of Hollywood people, no doubt. That's understandable. From the sports world, you have Maverick Carter, who was Lyndon Johnson. I have LBJ written down. LeBron James, business associate, Maverick Carter. Magic Johnson, famous basketball player. A lot of sports, a lot of athletes, like that. But these are wealthy people, right? And they clearly believe that their interests will be protected in a Harris administration, just like they were in a Biden administration. And look at what they're bragging about. One of the things they brag about the most is the stock market, right? The Democrats boast of, look at what the stock market's done. Every day I see memes from liberal operatives. Look at what the stock market's done, right? 10% of Americans own 88% of the stock market. Whether the stock market's at 41,000 or 20,000, it doesn't affect that many people in terms of what they actually possess, in terms of their actual, wealth. And many of those 10% have it in a pension plan. These are people who are supporting the Democrats because they believe that their economic interests are going to be defended and supported, protected, maybe even enhanced. And they're probably right.
A lot of people who signed that letter were actually former CEOs, like a lion's share, I believe, like the former CEO of Pepsi and the former CEO of Lyft and GoDaddy and Starbucks, PayPal. And then the other thing to note is that there's, even though they're in C-suite, they weren't necessarily CEOs, but a lot of people from Wall Street, like Goldman Sachs and Blackstone, which I guess is contrary to Steve Schwarzman, but the former COO and president of Blackstone has signed this letter. And while maybe some of the people who are supporting Trump are, what I actually see is like a little bit on the margins of some of the the political economy, is that the sort of people who are doing a lot of the work within, at least at the executive level of a lot of companies across the country, are supporting Harris. Is what this, if this is like representative versus who's representative of Trump. That honestly, most of maybe it's just because it's who's the sort of named ones, a lot of the people supporting Trump, who are very wealthy, extremely wealthy, seem to be more wingnutty to me. Elon Musk is a wingnut to me, even though he's the richest man in the world. And the sort of people who are running the structure of capitalism and of the political economy in this country and the world are people who are backing Harris.
Yeah. And again, I think that gets to this kind of idea of lump with oligarchs, right? These are
Right.
people who come from older or dying industries in a lot of cases. Bitcoin is a good example, right? The Bitcoin people love Trump, right?
Yeah.
Bitcoin people are loving oligarchs. They're not like Swedes, Wall Street, white shoe offer type people, right? The Adelsons made their money on casinos. That's not a traditional. I'd be curious to see. I won't be surprised if a lot of these online gambling sites, the people who run them and all now support Trump, right?
Musk family were South African diamond miners, right?
Zambia, actually, but
Zambia.
just to be correct about it. Yeah.
Sorry.
It was funny because Musk's father, even last year, came out publicly and said, "You never worked a day in your life." And a lot of these people are in like the tech industry or the communications industry. People like Musk are doing this, right? Because they have a vested interest in controlling dialogue. This is about political power, it's money. Musk is going to get government contracts no matter who the president is. Apple and all of these corporations will get Google. They're all going to get government contracts no matter what. And the other thing is if they piss off Harris or Biden, it's not that big a deal. If you piss Trump off, he may sick the Justice Department against you. File charge, who knows what he could do because he's already vowed retribution against the entire damn world. And that's unstable, right? If you're going to go around with buses, literally just mass arresting people, think might be here illegally, you can see where that's headed.
This week, he said he's going to put Democratic donors up on Trump,
Right.
which I would assume would be some of these, this wealthy elite.
Yeah, that's that. It's a really destabilizing thing. And we're not here to make any kind of proactive case for the Democratic Party. There's none to be made, but I think it's interesting to see this. And with regard to the military too, there was just another statement put out by 10 military leaders, which included Esper, and I forget who the others were, right?
Larry Ellis,
Yeah.
retired Admiral Michael Smith. Also there's a big talking point that's now going up in military circles, which Harris brought up in the debate, which is about how Trump's negotiation with the Taliban actually released 5,000 of the group's fighters to return to the battlefield. And he brought the Taliban to Camp David, right? Whatever. I think there's lots of other people in the Camp David who I see as horrible dictators and war criminals and things like that. So I wasn't that put off when that came up, but still, apparently the elite don't like that.
Yeah. When in the late 90s or maybe even in 2000, as late as 2000, the Taliban came to Houston to talk to the oil oligarchs in town here.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. And so you have the point here. There's a couple of points I think are important. One is that things aren't going to be moved to the left. And people who think you could move Harris to the left, I think are just like dreaming, right? All I have to say is they've embraced the Cheneys, they've embraced Kinzinger and all these other people. And they sat back and let AIPAC do a filthy good job on people like Bowman and Cori Bush and others. But Bowman and Bush, they took out. And then when Cori Bush blamed AIPAC, the White House condemned her for blaming AIPAC for it. Clearly, there is enough ruling class support for Harris that the idea that you're going to vote and then push her to take positions you believe in is just simply wrong. Look, I think didn't Rick Perlstein, brilliant liberal, he's the smartest guy in the world, isn't he? No, I think Ben Burgess might be the smartest guy. Which one? That would be a hell of a contest. Let's have a debate.
They should have a debate. They should have a debate.
Burgess versus Perlstein. It would be like Einstein versus Niels Bohr and Oppenheimer, right? Anyway, but the Perlstein, what did he say? You'd be a moral idiot if you don't vote for Harris or something like that, right? And so the point here is that you're not pushing these people anywhere to the left on any issue, even no matter how much public support you have. Remember, they had a chance to do something about abortion for decades and didn't touch it. And all these women said, and if you overturn Roe v. Wade, we will be ungovernable. How many ungovernable protests in the streets have you seen since Dobbs? In the 2 years since Dobbs? Have you seen any? I haven't seen.
Not on that issue.
No. Harris, in last month alone, Harris last month alone raised $350 million, 3 times more than Trump, right? Now I know they brag about small donations and all that. She's also getting some rainmaker money from big shots.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
The one thing, while we're on the topic of left and moving people to the left, or if we're going to move people to the left, is that probably the most revered living person on the left in politics right now, Bernie Sanders, this weekend, actually after Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney both endorsed Kamala Harris, Bernie came out and said that he sees eye to eye on nothing with Dick Cheney, but they do both believe in the institution of American democracy. So he's glad that he came out and supported Harris. And I just want to say, when we're talking about figures who are moving Harris or moving Biden to the left, and I think Sanders and Warren both contributed to, I actually think Biden on a lot of domestic stuff was a lot better than any of his predecessors. Gaza stuff is like out the window for me. But I want to say that it seems like AOC and Bernie, who are the two sort of like biggest noted people in politics who claim to be of the left, are not representing that perspective. And Dick Cheney stole the 2000 election. He like lied to start a war. He helped oversee of the largest surveillance state in the history of the world, right? There's no democratic institutions going on there. And so I've actually wanted to rant about that for a minute. It's very troubling, right? And I want Trump defeated. And I think that's where Bernie's coming from, but still it's very troubling. He needs to have a little bit more of I feel like there could be a little bit more of a thoughtful position on that.
And where did Cheney get his wealth from?
Oil and gas and military industrial complex.
Government contracts.
Oh yeah, for those industries.
Halliburton, KBR, they were getting mega billion-dollar government contracts throughout this for the defense industry. Before the war began in 2000, Halliburton was already receiving contracts to rebuild Iraq before the war even started.
Yeah, talking about wealth. And he was out of being the CEO of Halliburton at the time.
I know.
Like he was vice president at the time, and he was given the contracts to his former company.
Yeah, talk about a welfare queen, right? Taking government money. That's the big point, I think, which is that you're not moving up to the left. The second point, though, is I think, and we said this throughout 2020, which is why we talked about it. When I've been accused of being an apologist for the military or for whatever, what you got, like I've said many times, in the absence of a real left resistance, a straight resistance, you got to deal with reality. You got to deal with things as they are. And right now, I think defeating Trump, I still believe is important, right? You have to depose this regime and get rid of it, right? But what this does, I think, is create, and I've said this before, create spaces. And it sounds like cheesy and corny and inadequate, and to some degree it is, but you need to create spaces in which real resistance, real opposition can emerge organically. And if you continue to focus on nothing but vote for Harris, vote in the election, vote blue no matter who, or the Democrats suck because they won't let us on the ballot in these states or whatever, right? Anytime you continue to obsess and focus exclusively on these elections that occur once every 4 years, you're essentially forfeiting the ability to organize and to create a resistance, to create an oppositional political culture. That's why you don't want Trump as president. It should be easier. But as we've seen, especially with Gaza, right? If Trump had been doing this, that the protests would have been way bigger and way more aggressive, right? And you would have
seen elements in the Democratic Party, like elected officials, figures of resistance in congressional hearings.
AOC getting arrested at Columbia or at NYU. She would have been there getting arrested, right?
You'd see Bernie and Elizabeth Warren and people like that, like making statements from the floor of the Senate, that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Bernie has done that in this current situation, but it's pretty inadequate. Yeah.
It's very inadequate. Right? So I think this is something I've followed closely for a very long time. And I think it's important, right? This isn't a monolith. It's not a homogenous group. They're not allies of the people. They're not big class champions or anything like that. But the fact is they don't all see the same way. This isn't a monolith. This can even get back to the stuff we talked about a lot. Is this fascism? Was Trump a fascist, right? And again, if you're going to be really a fascist, you need that control, or at least that kind of really close sync kind of cooperation with corporate community. And you're not getting that. And when they've been very vocal in their opposition to Trump, and I think at the end of the day, they're calling his bluff that he's not going to do anything to them. Probably won't. But the fact is, while that's happening, we should be like moving off into, I think, other terrain to organize. And I think you're seeing labor's done a pretty good job of that with the unions and Amazon and these kind of some more aggressive labor tactics, organizing tactics. And clearly we're seeing that with the students on campus who I think have done really inspirational stuff.
I think just because it's the world where I come from, I think we've been seeing some element of that with some of the climate campaigns as well. I've done a couple of shows on it, but was some good campaign work this summer and going after Citibank and like really creating a little bit of a mini crisis at city headquarters in New York and things like that.
And it's what's telling is because I don't know if I sent it to you or not, like most people in Pennsylvania don't support fracking. So you have this knee-jerk reaction, and the Democrats do this all the time. As soon as you're accused of something, you immediately move to the right. You're this, you're that, right? Like you believe in aborting kids after they're born, or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And they just move like further out. And instead of taking a position, you say, hey, look, fracking most people don't like it. It's really bad for the environment. It's not that hard. Like public healthcare, right? People need healthcare. It's not that hard. Most people support that. Most people hate their insurance companies, hate their health plans. Everybody I talked to is pissed off. I had to pay this. I couldn't get an appointment. I couldn't do this. I couldn't do that. And they run away from all of this. And so it's a party that embraces Dick Cheney and rejects Cory Bush. And I think that says a lot. And because of that, it gets the support of a bunch of Wall Street CEOs and other people who have huge assets and huge wealth. And we need to take account and try to strategically figure out how to maneuver in that kind of, you have to deal with what I think Marx called it objective reality or material, I think objective conditions, I believe, of capitalism. And we have to deal with that. We can't like pretend things are where they're not. We can't pretend there's some kind of nascent left wing wave coming up. It's not there. We have to make it.
Yeah. And I think it's worth noting that the capitalists have it figured out that when there is a disaster or when there is a crisis, they're like so well organized, they can move in quickly to take advantage of it. They privatize housing in New Orleans because all the people have left due to hurricanes, things like that. We could be that well organized. We could move on these crises as quickly and efficiently as in murder of George Floyd or the sort of crisis around Gaza. We've seen left movements move in very effectively in that and like challenge power. As we've said on the show before, we make the argument that Biden stepped down because we were expose his weakness in that crisis, right? The uprisings of 2020 showed what a lot of the issues, I guess you could say, with Donald Trump through those uprisings, like showed his ass and was able to like turn off a lot of America, partially because of his response to the George Floyd uprisings. And so there's moments where we can move in. We just need to like, I think it happens a little bit more organically, and it would be good if it was more institutionalized and more strategic and more effective.
Yeah.
Although bringing down two presidents that is pretty effective.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we should be talking about that every day. Like we forced Biden out.
Yeah.
Right. The debate, I didn't watch the first debate. Everything I read about it was just utterly horrific. But like the reason he was so weak and vulnerable and coming across as so fucking addled was because of this sustained opposition to this genocide.
And the Trump family takes credit for destroying Biden's career. But let's just be clear. It was the anti-genocide movement, which
that's
undermined Trump. I don't give a shit what Donald Trump Jr. said.
Yeah.
Fuck him.
No, that's what put him out. I think that's the reason John Shapiro is the vice president candidate right now as well. It's funny you mentioned like when things go bad, it's like that's disaster capitalism, right? That existed long before Naomi Klein ever invented that term or came up with that term, right?
Yeah.
What Klein is writing about, which it's actually an old idea. And capitalists go in, they call it never waste a good crisis, right? And so they're aware of it. And this is one of those. So we've had a series of systemic crises. Let's go back. A lot of the word has been on 1968, the systemic crises of 1968. Because we're seeing that in the election in France a couple of months ago, where the left-wing party actually, I think, got the most votes, but now Macron is reaching out to the far right to create a governing coalition to abandon it, right? So this is happening all over.
And their prime minister's coming from the fourth place party.
Yeah. And you have this continued assault.
I think got like 5% of the vote or something.
Yeah. No, you have this right-wing assault on this American assault on Venezuela, which say what you want. We're not here to have a discussion on that, although we will soon. I want to do a show on Venezuela, but this is a bipartisan attack on a sovereign country, right? And they agree that the sanctions against Iran, Middle Eastern policy, there's this great harmony of interest there. And this has been going on for some time. So this is where we are in 2024. And I think understanding the material conditions, the objective conditions of what's actually going on politically. And I would say rather than going apoplectic about Cornel West or Jill Stein or whatever, RFK or whoever, people should focus on what they can do at a community level, at maybe a regional level. Can you organize a union? Can you get your union to take a stand on certain issues? Will you go on the streets and protest? That kind of thing this is what we should be doing right now.
This is the same message we had in 2020, where we would talk about actually the elites were pretty well organized and aligned against Trump because he created destabilization. And our message in 2020 was that people need to go out and I believe it's Stokely Carmichael. We would quote Kwame Ture organize. And that's our message. A lot of our audience are people who find themselves on the left, organize. And don't just do it yourself. Go start a group, get involved with a group, whether it's DSA or your 350 chapter or what have you. Go out and get involved and organize, because it's where a lot of power comes from. And don't be averse to power, build power. That's what these people respect. That's why Trump got put out in 2020. That's why Biden stepped down in 2024, is because we built power and resisted.
Trump doesn't, no, I don't think anybody in the Republican Party fears the Democratic Party. Nobody fears the Democrats or the Washington Generals. I think they do fear what happened in 2020. That shook them. I think they really did. And well, just how you have to do it. The Democratic Party is an organized street protest and be down with that, right? What was telling you is as soon as the Supreme Court came down with the immunity ruling, right? President has immunity, right? Joe Biden was president. His first statement was, I won't do anything like this at all, right? He didn't even bluff and say, this applies to me too. Like the Democratic Party isn't going to instill any kind of fear or any kind of reservations in the souls of these right-wing crusaders. So we're going to have to do that.
Civility. It's civility, Bob.
Yeah. And you're going to have to do that by getting in the streets at huge numbers, right? No business as usual, right? Really be ungovernable, not people sipping tea and eating cucumber sandwiches claim they're going to be ungovernable, but really be ungovernable. And look at the vehemence with which they responded that spring to students on campus just protesting peacefully. And if you think that somehow an election is going to change the numbers.
Yeah. But maybe that's the twist, is that the elites' kids were getting cracked down on, or their neighbors' kids were getting cracked down on. And therefore, there were a lot of Democratic donors who said they were going to step back on supporting Biden because they felt he was so incompetent after that debate. But part of it is they were turned off by the response to the pro-Palestine protests and occupations on campuses. Potentially, I have no data on it, but just a thought.
And you're not, but I think it could be realistic to a simple amount. Just look at, we do have data though. Look at how Biden tanked in the last, 7-8 months, and look at the numbers of Americans who oppose it. Every poll we show for several months now, the big majority of Americans want this thing over and want the U.S. to withdraw, whatever, unnecessarily withdraw, but clearly change the situation, right?
Yeah.
So we do have doubt. We do know that it matters and it's gotten to them and it's affecting them. And I believe if they lose the election, they're going to blame whoever, but that'll be the reason. Especially if you lose Michigan, and Pennsylvania, that's a big deal. And a lot of that's going to come down to Gaza.
And Jill Stein is pulling ahead in Wisconsin and Michigan and Arizona with Muslim voters currently.
Hey,
pulling ahead of Trump and Harris.
Yeah. If somebody says, I don't want them killing your families in Gaza, I would respond to that, right? It makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Yeah. I think Harris really does have a path to winning. She's not going to win a victory at whatever, but I think if she were to step back from Israel, that would create a path for her to win a little more easily than Trump. It's difficult to talk about this, right? Because the idea of Trump being president again is horrific on a million different levels. The idea of Harris being president is nothing to celebrate either. So it's going back to the old word, is the kind of gentler machine gun hand.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, we should wrap up. But the one thing I want to say is that I never really knew that J.D. Vance and Donald Trump were so concerned about animal rights. I just want to say that all of my friends in the vegan resistance are probably jumping for joy to hear J.D. Vance going out advocating against the eating of cats and dogs.
I thought the same thing. What do they want to eat? Like tofu and seitan and tempeh? What are they going to eat? They don't eat.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, and just for the audience out there, you should research into that story, because there's no evidence whatsoever of Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, or anywhere else eating animals, eating pets. It's all bullshit.
Actually, I don't know what the number is, but they called it an influx. So I don't know how many that meant, but a bunch of Haitian immigrants who moved to Springfield, it's revitalized the entire town.
Yeah. There's a factory or something where they're working at.
If immigration is a labor issue, which nobody wants to deal with, it's a labor issue. It's cheap labor. And these oligarchs don't want to end immigration. How's going to work? Texas, where I live here, I don't know who's going to do anything. You walk around the other day, it was 110 freaking degrees a couple of weeks ago. And across the street from me, there's 3 guys on a roof putting shingles on 110-degree heat, and they were all Mexicans, right? And so, like, the whole freaking state would shut down if you actually did something about migration.
It's also important to note that crime rates are in no way related to immigrants.
No, immigrants. Yeah. The crime
Immigrant
rates
communities are
totally-
actually, with immigrant communities.
In fact, a very powerful statement, a father in, I think, Springfield, his son was killed by a driver, a Haitian guy who was driving. His son was killed. And Vance and Trump have been talking about that a lot. And the father came out today very poignantly and powerfully said, stop it. Quit bringing my son's name into this. The guy even said, I wish my son had been hit by and killed by a car driven by a 60-year-old white guy. And that just shows how cruel and ignorant and fetid and low that these people are. And I know for liberals, that's all it takes, right? I've heard so many times the Obamas were classy. They're good people and they're not Trump. And that's all true. And the Republican Party is really pretty fucking toxic and fetid. It's pretty bad. It really is. So this is where we are. And after November, what's the election, the 5th this year? So I don't know, whatever date, the day after the election, on that Wednesday, we got a lot of work to do. The election just begins at then your target is and you go after. But you got to, do something about that. And
November 5th. Yes.
Yeah. Well, the ruling class is able to soften the field a little bit, to weaken them a bit. That's great. It creates these fissures. But we need to find these spaces and enter into them and organize people. And what's not as hard to do, right? They have violence at their disposal. They can call out guards, they can call out rent-a-cops, they can call out the police, they can call out the military, whatever, right? And we don't that. But we do have a huge, significant, huge group of people in the United States who think the way we do on a lot of these issues. And I think breaking that connection, that umbilical cord with the Democratic Party is really important. But also finding where these spaces are where corporate types disagree with each other and trying to enter those.
I think you talked about how America's a right-wing country. I think it's important to note that the institutions are very right-wing and very conservative. I think a lot of the people are not.
Yeah.
The majority of Americans supported the burning down of a police precinct in 2020.
Yeah.
The majority of Americans want a ceasefire or oppose the U.S. sending weapons to Israel. So we're not outnumbered, as Malcolm actually used to say, we're out-organized.
Oh, yeah. When people say you hate America, it's like, what does that even mean? What is America? It's these institutions run by these oligarchs. Yeah, I do hate those. The American people, there's some fucking awesome people in this country that of us have encountered and admired and worked with over the years. Yeah, I do think that. If you look at data on major issues, Democrats run away from it. Gun violence, hell, something like, I don't know, almost 3/4 of NRA members believe in certain gun control laws. On abortion rights, there's always been a significant majority. We're seeing that now. Even in red states, you're getting 60% of the vote. On all these major issues, on climate change, on the environment, on wages, on all these issues, like healthcare, right? Americans are taking, I don't know, whatever word you want to use, progressive or advanced position. And the Democratic Party abandons it. In lieu of any kind of political resistance, we do end up relying on the likes of Jamie Dimon and Mark Milley.
It's true.
And it's not optimal. It's not desirable, but this is where we are.
Dick Cheney.
Dick Cheney, the hero of the resistance, right?
We should probably wrap.
Yeah.
Folks, you've been listening to the Green and Red podcast, talking about one of our favorite topics, which is elites and liberal elites and elite support for the supposed liberal party. If you like what you're hearing, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching us on YouTube, subscribe. If you're listening to us on one of the many audio platforms, give us a rate and review. And then if you really like us, go to greenandredpodcast.org and hit the support button or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. Until then, make a lot of trouble and misbehave. And we'll come back at you soon. Talk to you later.
You're Satan the devil.